Hello everyone! I was contemplating doing a Hitchcock video this week since it's been a long time since I did an entry in that review series, but there really aren't any Hitchcock movies that I haven't reviewed yet that I feel like watching right now. So instead, let's talk about a classic crime thriller from another famous director, M, directed by Fritz Lang, which was released in Germany in 1931 and is about the hunt for a child killer played by Peter Lorre. Many people have left me comments about this film, and I've made quite a few references to it myself in past videos. I first saw it years ago, back when I started watching old movies in earnest, not just because they were around and I grew up watching them, but because I realized I preferred them and I wanted to expand my horizons. M is one of the ones I rented from the library early on, and it stayed with me because it's an unforgettable film. Director Fritz Lang's earliest successes were silent expressionist films, such as the first Dr. Mabuse entry, Dr. Mabuse der Spieler, the epic fantasy Die Nibelungen, and the dystopian science fiction masterpiece Metropolis. M was one of the last movies he made in Germany. He wound up fleeing Nazi rule just 2 years later and eventually emigrated to the United States, where he continued to flourish as a highly influential filmmaker, making significant contributions to the noir movement of the 40s and 50s. M was his first sound feature, and boy did he take advantage of the new technology. It's an astonishingly aural film, ahead of its time in terms of how sound, or the conspicuous lack of sound, is used. This emphasis on sound is present from the very start. M's famous prologue opens with a babyish voice reciting a gruesome rhyme about the killer as the neighborhood kids play an elimination game. Then, while a mother prepares for her daughter to come home from school, our attention is drawn to a cuckoo clock, a school bell, a car horn, all indications of the day advancing. A girl, the daughter, bounces a ball on the pavement until she encounters the central character, the deranged killer, whose shadow is cast across a poster offering a reward for his capture. He looms over the girl and asks her name, then he leads her away, and as he buys her a balloon, we hear him whistle in the Hall of the Mountain King. At home, the mother is now concerned about the girl's absence, and as we linger over shots of noticeably vacant spaces, we hear the agitated parent calling her daughter's name, her cries increasingly more frantic. Then there's silence as the film cuts to the girl's ball rolling out of some bushes, and her balloon, momentarily snared in some wires, blowing away in the wind. It's a remarkably strong opening, Lang using all the tools of his trade to build up tension before we've even learned who the main players are. This was Peter Lorre's first starring role. He was 27 here and had only appeared in a handful of small parts before this, yet Lang allegedly crafted the character with him in mind, casting him without a preliminary audition. The job wasn't exactly a pleasant one for Lorre. Lang was an aggressive and at times abusive director who, allegedly, threw his star down the stairs to make him look more battered in the final sequence. At least Lang seems to have been pleased with the result, as he later rated this his favorite of his films. But for Lorre, the role was both a blessing and a curse. It propelled his career forward and made him a recognizable figure worldwide, but the public often recognized him for the wrong reasons, associating him with the role as if he were the character. Like Lang, Lorre, who was also Jewish, born Laszlo Loewenstein, fled Germany shortly thereafter. His next hit was in the UK, where he played the main villain in Alfred Hitchcock's first version of The Man Who Knew Too Much. Though he hadn't yet fully grasped the English language, he learned most of his lines phonetically and pretty much stole the show. He then made his home in Hollywood, where he carved out a remarkable, if not always illustrious and fulfilling, career. I really enjoy Peter Lorre. He was an underrated talent who did a great job no matter what kind of role he was given, and despite what some may believe, he did not always play a bad guy, a spooky guy, or a slimy little creep. He did play some good guys as well, albeit far too few, and he could be an appealing personality on screen. But even those of us who find him endearing must acknowledge that the uniqueness of his features made him a good fit for the unsavory parts he played. His face here has a soft roundness that makes him seem childlike and approachable, but he can quickly turn his lax, harmless expression into that of a crazed, self-indulgent predator. I think there's an element of surrealism to Lorre's performance, which contributes to the movie's expressionist vibe. And that, paired with the imagery of a police procedural or a detective drama, makes M a film noir prototype. Before we go any further, I would like to toss a warning out there. First, if you haven't seen the film already, you might not want to continue because I will eventually be discussing the last act in some detail. Second, in a minute I'll be alluding to some things that certain viewers may not want to hear about. It's not going to be explicit, I won't go into detail, but for some people it may be too dark. It might not be something that when you come to my channel, you're signing up to hear about. So consider this a content advisory. Now everybody's gonna be like, oh my goodness, what is she gonna say? A major theme in M is the collective frustration over the police's failure to apprehend the serial killer. The police have tied themselves up in knots trying to find a trail without a single substantial clue. The prolonged manhunt takes its toll on the weary community, people growing suspicious of friends, neighbors, and passing strangers. Innocent men become victims of paranoid informers, anonymous tips, and overzealous onlookers mere seconds away from forming a violent mob. Gradually, the film introduces us to the criminal underworld, and Lang engages in some clever counterpoint here, showing the lawful and unlawful organizations each holding a meeting to discuss the killer.
Ich bitte, sich dazu zu äußern, meine Herren.
The organized crime syndicate is furious with the murderer, not just because of what he's doing to children, but because he's got the police out in full force, breathing down their necks so that nobody can do any business. They don't trust the police to get to the bottom of it, so they decide to take matters into their own hands, implementing their own network of surveillance, assigning beggars along the streets to maintain constant vigilance and hopefully catch the killer in the act, which works, and how that unfolds is very satisfying. But give credit where it's due, the police's more pedantic efforts do prove successful as well, and it's through them that we find out the killer's name is Hans Beckert. Both his eccentric behavior and the horrendous nature of his crimes make Hans Beckert Lorre's most repulsive character. To dispel any doubts or confusion about just what kind of criminal we're talking about here, they do mention that his victims are both little girls and boys, and there is an instance where he's described as a sex offender, so the film didn't go into detail there, which I think is wise, but you can draw your own conclusions. Two names are referenced in this film, Grossman and Harmon. I didn't immediately recognize these names, but I assumed they must be high-profile murderers of yesteryear, and against my better judgment, I looked them up and ended up spending a pretty miserable 2 to 3 hours on Wikipedia reading the sickening articles about them and their crimes. Grossman is Carl Grossman, a serial killer, child molester, and alleged cannibal suspected of murdering up to 100 women and girls. He's rumored to have used the remains of his victims as meat at his hot dog stand. While in custody in 1922, he killed himself rather than face punishment for his sadistic crimes. He sounds like a real creep, but so does Harmon. Harmon is Fritz Harmon, also known as the Butcher of Hanover, a serial killer and sex offender who claimed the lives of at least 24 boys and men between the ages of 10 and 22. The mutilation and dismemberment of his victims earned him the additional nicknames of the Vampire of Hanover and the Wolfman. He is also rumored to have sold his victims' remains as meat on the black market. He was executed in 1925. Like the fictional Beckert, Harmon had been institutionalized, but he escaped and fled to another country until it was safe to return, at which point his criminal activity resumed and intensified, which is what the mob believes will happen with Beckert if he's not dealt with properly. Like Beckert, Harmon claimed his crimes were not premeditated, but he would suddenly be overwhelmed by an all-consuming urge to kill. Likewise, the hunt for Harmon was a huge story that got international coverage and drew police scrutiny. Harmon, a known sex offender, had worked his way into the police's good graces by becoming an informer and was a regular visitor at the police station. Despite the fact they knew of his proclivities and his criminal record while all these teenage boys were going missing, they somehow never considered him a suspect. I believe these are the only serial killers mentioned in the film, but frequently claims are made that M was chiefly inspired by the case of Peter Kürten, the so-called Vampire of Dusseldorf or Dusseldorf Monster. That's another horrific Wikipedia entry that should make you feel sick. Kürten was a textbook psychopath, a sadist who murdered at least 9 people of both sexes and various ages, and attempted to kill at least 31 others. His vicious crime spree in 1929 led to a widespread investigation and public outcry. Like Beckert, he sent letters to the police, and he had a map printed in the newspaper indicating where one of his victims' bodies could be found. Kürten was arrested in May 1930. He was put on trial in April 1931. M was released in Berlin in May 1931, and Kürten was executed in July. So there is definitely overlap there. Undoubtedly, the bulk of Lang's audience would have been familiar with all 3 of these notorious cases, especially that one would still have been fresh in the public's mind and probably still making headlines at the time of this film's release. That said, Lang himself denied that he and wife/writer Thea von Harbu were inspired by the Vampire of Dusseldorf when they collaborated on this script. They were determined to make their story as horrifying and realistic as possible, so they each conducted ample research on these and other high-profile cases, looking at crime scenes, conferring with police, visiting mental institutions, and interviewing killers and sex offenders whenever permissible. These infamous serial killers are thoroughly depraved monsters, and there are no acceptable excuses for their behavior and their actions. In my book, there are no acceptable excuses, no reasonable justifications for anyone who preys on children. I realize that a few people out there will find that a controversial, inflammatory, or even offensive comment, but that's a point on which I will not compromise. This is not a morally gray area. This is plain and simple, black and white. If you participate in sexual activity with a child, you are guilty of a heinous crime. Now, Lorre's character doesn't seem as appalling as any of these real-life sickos, probably because there was a limit to what they could show. But even so, there is an ick moment. It's the change that comes over Beckert when he spots a girl's reflection in the shop window. But his response afterward, when the girl evades him, gives us our first inkling that perhaps this is a side of himself he loathes, a twisted obsession he wants to escape but can't. One of the most prominent elements in this film is the stalker whistling in the Hall of the Mountain King when he finds a new victim. This killer's calling card is one of the earliest applications of a leitmotif in film. A leitmotif is a musical theme associated with a particular character, which is a concept that was popularized by German composer Richard Wagner in his operas. It's actually Fritz Lang and not Peter Lorre who whistles the tune, which was written by Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg in 1875 for Ibsen's play Peer Gynt, and later became part of Grieg's Peer Gynt Suite No. 1. Starting deceptively soft and low in the Hall of the Mountain King, gets faster and louder over the course of 90 seconds, building into a frenzied crescendo and ending chaotically. The piece is strongly associated with M, but it's had many more appearances over the years in films, commercials, scary Halloween time things, and also that fantastic line writer video made by Doodle Chaos, and in the 70s, the Portsmouth Sinfonia recorded a wonderfully horrible rendition that I particularly love. But I digress. By the way, it's interesting to note there are several other whistlers in this film. I'm not sure of the purpose behind that. Are they fake-outs or red herrings? I don't think so. Based on the context, it doesn't seem like any of those instances, any of those whistles are supposed to confuse us and make us think, wait, is that the killer? But at the same time, it sure seems like an awful lot of whistling to just be a coincidence. In the end, it's his jaunty whistling that gives Beckert away, and I love the brilliant strategy the guy comes up with to mark the suspect. That chalk M on Laurie's shoulder is one of the most iconic images. The underworld organization works like a dream as they track him through the streets and infiltrate the building where he seeks refuge. The police and the underworld end up closing in on Beckert at the same time, but the underworld takes action while the police are shown sitting around his dark apartment waiting for him to come home. When the Nazi Party took control, they didn't appreciate the criticism of authority here, resulting in the films being banned and locked away for decades. Once Beckert realizes they're onto him, he becomes a cornered rat, his face a sweaty, goggle-eyed mask of terror. He knows what he's done, and he knows what he deserves. Again, Lang ramps up the tension in the sequence where they come after him, adding suspense with the alarm key and all those flights of stairs and the search of the storage lockers. Several times it seems like he's gonna get away. For the climax, the action moves to an abandoned distillery where Beckert is thrown before a cold, vengeful crowd and a panel of judges who are already decided on his guilt and his sentence. Beckert begins raving that they have no right to treat him this way, which prompts the audience to ponder, is he entitled to the same rights as everyone else, or did he forfeit those rights with the enormity of his crimes? We're on the mob's side here, but we have to recognize that what they're trying to pull off is not a civilized form of justice, and Beckert senses, accurately, that he'll be treated worse by them than by the police, who at least have rules in place for handling all manner of criminals, and if they don't abide by those rules, they're supposed to be held accountable. This mob doesn't care about any of that, and honestly, their thirst for revenge is as intense and frightening as the bloodlust of the murderer they're clamoring to convict. Laurie delivers one of the best performances of his life here when he gives his "but I can't help it" defense. He's such a good actor, and the script is so well written, that in spite of everything, his eloquent vehemence when speaking of the curse, fire, and agony of his compulsion, and his despairing acknowledgement of a sickness from which he cannot escape, is pitiful and even compelling. It doesn't absolve him of culpability, and if I were a grieving mother, it wouldn't make forgiveness any easier. That would still take an act of God, but the monologue does garner some sympathy. I do have to wonder, is it all an act? Is he just saying this to win some shred of compassion, so he'll be treated more humanely? But his speech is so desperate that I'm inclined to believe him when he speaks of his eternal torment, of being haunted by past victims and torn in two, one part not wanting to do these things, the other part telling him he must. it's even easier to accept this as truth because we have witnessed him having this battle in an earlier scene. And also, if we're honest with ourselves, I think that internal struggle is one we're all familiar with on some level. Obviously, this is a very extreme case, but I think there's something here that we can all relate to, even if we don't want to admit it. Lang closes his film the way I want to close this review, with a plea to the audience to be vigilant and to protect and defend the children. Lang felt this was the most important message, the thing he most wanted viewers to take away with them, and I can't agree enough. We need to look out for children. Parents bear the responsibility to care for them and need to take that job seriously. Be engaged in their lives, be available so they'll feel comfortable talking or asking questions, and pay attention to what's happening in schools and on playgrounds and online, everywhere. But even those of us who don't have kids should keep our eyes open as well and be knowledgeable about predatory behavior and distress signals and all the insidious ways that children are being targeted now. We have a responsibility to be vigilant because older children, younger children, babies, they can't just take care of themselves, and parents aren't always there. If you do see someone, and I mean anyone, in serious trouble, do something about it. Be smart, be careful, but take some action. Don't just turn your head aside and say, "Not my problem, I'm not getting involved." M may not be the kind of movie I want to see again and again, but it's a great film, miles ahead of most of its contemporaries in its use of sound effects and voiceover, not to mention photography and editing. Its focus on disturbing criminal psychology is daring, the story unfolds in an engrossing way, and it's capped off with a timeless message that everyone should take to heart. Those are my thoughts on M. I'm not sure how enjoyable this was given the subject matter, but I hope you found it an informative and thought-provoking review. If you have seen this famous and influential film, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, so go ahead and share those in the comments below, and I will be back next week with something much lighter, I promise. Thanks for watching.